Welcome, everybody, to the Red Life podcast. My name is Kiran Fatima, and today we're going to be talking with a panel about China. This is a very hot topic these days. There's a lot of stuff going on in the media, especially Western Canadian, US, and European media about China. Recently, there were allegations against China that we will be discussing today about China's treatment of the Uyghur Muslim people. And we hope that you're going to be joining us for the whole presentation today, the whole panel discussion today. So there are things that we are being told constantly by public and private media, corporate media about China that we are basically not allowed to question in any way. We are being bombarded with stories about how China is detrimental for human rights, and we are not really being told that China has, for example, lifted over 800 million people out of extreme poverty, and that China has committed to being completely carbon neutral by 2060, which is only in 39 years. We are not told that China provided over 90% of the PPE to the world during the COVID pandemic. And there are lots of other things that we're not told. So we want to also show that we are going to have a critical discussion about China, where we're going to challenge some of these mainstream discourses. So first, I want to introduce my co-host, Moxie. You're muted. 1 second. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Can you hear me now? All good?
Yep.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. And this is absolutely an essential episode. Kiran and I really feel the need to discuss some of the claims being made against China, and to really kind of look at them with a critical but principled eye, and of course from an anti-imperialist perspective. So this was really important for me to want to do this with Kiran today for the Red Life podcast. We're also, just recently in Canada, because that's where we're streaming from, on February the 22nd, Canadian Parliament voted overwhelmingly to declare China's treatment of the Uyghur population a genocide. This is a massive, massive claim. And it's a dangerous claim. This could potentially mean like all kinds of critical things when it comes to war and people who are trying to promote peace in the world. One of our guests today is a peace activist, and Omar, and he can speak to some of that a little later. So what's also happening is that anybody questioning these claims, among other claims, on social media or even just in regular circles, is being called a genocide denier. So that's really silencing. It's dangerous because of the silencing aspect. It's also dangerous because it shuts down critical thought and critical questioning, which is important when there's a looming threat of war. So we really want to try and focus today on some of the characteristics of sort of the Western imperialist forces, what Western imperialism sort of is, like some of their characteristics, and maybe how that might be playing into some of the things that we're seeing today around China. So today we have guests Omar and Fiona, and they're here to discuss some of these issues and shine a bit of a light on this stuff as well, of what many people are calling a Cold War. And there is a potential for it to escalate into a physical war. But let's maybe start and I'm going to throw it back to Kiran. And Kiran, if you can give us a few more like important facts about China that we can shine a little bit of a light on that we don't really hear much about in the West.
Thanks, Moxie. Yeah, there's a lot to discuss. I don't think that China is a perfect state or anything like that. I think there are issues, like in any country, there are always going to be some issues. But I think that what we're hearing is this extreme vilification of China in the media, whether it's CBC or BBC or CNN or Fox News or any of those. They all seem to agree that China is this monster that must be stopped. And it seems to me that it's really uniform. Nobody's allowed to question. They don't bring in any alternative perspective in any of their analyses. They don't bring in anybody who challenges this narrative. And what they're doing is they're relying on the state apparatus, the United States and the Canadian state apparatus, to promote a very anti-China agenda, which really feeds into the fact that China poses an economic competition, a competitor, a rival to the United States, because China is the second largest economy in the world right now. China is the only country that had economic growth this past year during the pandemic, even through the trade war and the pandemic. Even with all that said, China is it poses this threat, but it's not posing a threat on purpose. It's not trying to pose a threat. It's basically just expanding its own technological prowess. And along the way, it's becoming more and more economically powerful, which I think threatens the US and its allies like Canada. And so there's this narrative that's being built up in the media that it pulls at our emotional heartstrings that, oh my God, they're doing these horrible, mean things to people. But it's actually what's underlying this is this economic competition that the West cannot handle. The West is just playing dirty. So those are the kinds of things we want to talk about. I want to introduce our guests. We have Omar Latif here, who has actually been to Xinjiang, China, and is going to be talking about his experiences there, as well as talking about his perspective and his analyses. We also have Fiona Simm, who's joining us from the UK, and it's kind of late there. So thank you, Fiona, for joining us, even though it's later in the UK. And she's also going to be talking about her experience as an Asian person living in the West, as well as about her work trying to debunk some of these narratives about Xinjiang in particular. So guys, if you want to introduce yourself, Fiona, do you want to go first? Say hello and introduce yourself. You're muted.
As Kiran already said, my name is Fiona. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm based in London in the UK. I'm an anti-imperialist, communist, Marxist-Leninist specifically organizer. And in the past few years, I've taken a great interest in sort of researching what's been going on in Xinjiang as part of sort of my online agitation, and I'm involved in various anti-racist campaigns on the ground as well. So I'm delighted to have been invited onto this podcast tonight, and hopefully we can debunk some of those myths on the big bad China.
Thanks, Fiona.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you for your pronouns. I'll keep that in mind. Omar, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Omar Latif, living in Toronto. I'm a member of the Communist Party of Canada. In the summer of 2019, roughly the first 2 weeks in June, the end of May, first week, 2 weeks in June, I visited Xinjiang to see, as much as the tourists can see, what's happening. And I'm very happy to share my impressions from that visit and what I think is happening there as far as I can tell.
Thank you for that. Moxie, take it away.
Okay, well, I just wanted to sort of highlight a little bit of the nature of US imperialism. Just a little bit before we get into some nitty-gritty on discussion stuff, because it is an important piece to this. It really is. And, as Marxist-Leninists here, we're all Marxist-Leninists here at the table, and Lenin, described imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. So that's what we've been looking at over the course of, the last 100 years or so. There's a book called Imperialist Canada by Todd Gordon. And I like his description about imperialism, so I'm going to read this off too. Imperialism is a system of global inequalities and domination through which wealth is drained from the labor and resources of people to the systemic advantage of capital and, of course, capitalist countries. The capitalist and imperialist system in the USA and Canada, because Canada is absolutely an active partner with the USA in any imperialist ventures, so to speak. It's very much rooted in genocide. We absolutely in Canada have inflicted genocide on the Indigenous population in Canada. It's also about degradation of environment in Latin America, for instance, or the global South, through mining companies, through resource extractions, exploitation of workers, just outright thievery of lands. And of course, it's rooted in slavery, violent slavery, and wars. So part of the imperialist modus operandi, so to speak, is to invade other sovereign states, claiming humanitarian intervention, or claiming that they need to implement, Western democracy into other countries, sovereign countries. And of course, we've seen this by way of coups, most recently attempted coups in Bolivia and Venezuela, for instance. And of course, we all remember the weapons of mass destruction, very scary, that was, that fear, sort of inciting fear, and using these kinds of tactics to conjure emotions like anger, sadness, and fear. They're really powerful tools. The Bush era, had a racist ideological dimensions for the war on terror. This allowed the USA to devastate Middle Eastern, mostly Muslim countries, by the way, under the guise of self-protection and eliminating the terrorist threat. So Bush was quoted in saying, and this is from the White House Bush administration site, "Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it doesn't end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated." End quote. So if we look at Iraq, for instance, in the Middle East, we still have, U.S. military is still there. That's like 30 years now, I think. And, Omar, if I'm wrong, jump in anytime. But I think it's about 30 years. And alone in Iraq, it's estimated to be over 500,000 people dead. The death toll is 500,000 people. And of course, many of them civilians, women and children. I mentioned the coups and the implementing of Western democracy already. But, Canada has its own sort of little flavor of imperialism. And it's by way of mining, like predominantly and quite a bit, of course, in Latin America. And other places, but Latin America for sure. There's transnational corporations that are based in Canada, and they go into to Latin America. I think there's 10 main companies, if I'm not mistaken, to do resource extraction. So Canadian companies control as much as 70% of mining operations in Latin America. They rake in massive, massive profits, but at the same time are destroying communities through, and especially with environmental degradation. And this was taken from the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. So China and the current, what's happening now with the current imperialist policies it's important that we look at these, right? So much more can be highlighted in what I was just mentioning, but I was just trying to give a high level overview here. So some recent imperialist policies starting back in 2011 in the Obama era in the US was the pivot towards Asia policy, because China had this massively, very quickly growing economic boom. And it was just like they were just really becoming a real powerhouse player in the global economic field. And then after Obama, Trump, of course, continued with his version of this, and he incited a trade war on China. And of course, he instigated a lot of anti-Sino racism And things like, let's blame the COVID-19 pandemic on China to really try and incite this kind of rage against China. Now we see Biden furthering these policies and that he's getting tougher on China. And there's an article that I dug up in foreignpolicy.com, and they're basically saying, Biden really needs to get tough on China, and he needs to develop an Asia pivot to policy around China, because their GDP in China, the gross domestic product, is growing at a far faster rate than any other country in the world. And Kiran mentioned earlier, they are the second largest economic country in the world. Currently, the military bases around China are estimated to be 400, and these are US military bases. What's also happening is the expansion that the US is doing with their military around China and using Asia Pacific countries to sort of set up more Air Force bases and military camps, etc.
Hey, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
How many military bases does China have around the US?
Oh, none.
Okay.
And that's something to think about, right? Like, this is a pretty serious thing. You're setting up like hundreds of military bases around a sovereign state, around China, that isn't trying to instigate a war with you. So what is that, right? These are important things to look at while we're questioning this China discourse that's happening. So, the US to date has invaded or been militarily involved with 191 out of 193 countries, 98%. And in order to achieve all this war, the US and Canada and the West must manufacture consent of the population. This requires extensive, tactics and maneuvering, getting propaganda out, or, I'm using propaganda just for sake of, when it comes to terms of manufacturing consent. Okay, when I say propaganda, I'm not necessarily stating that everything that's coming out right now about China is that. I'm just using it in terms of manufacturing consent to have war. So it's really critical for the US and the Western imperialist forces to do that within their populations. And they often do this by way of media campaigns, showing photos, just bombarding us with lots of disinformation and different sort of mixed in with facts and falsities. So it convolutes things. And they even engage so-called academics.
Yeah.
Right, Kiran? What's that guy's name?
Well, let's get into that. That's exactly what I want to get into today. So if that's okay. So I want to start by talking to Omar. Omar, if you're there, please join us. I want us to discuss about your trip to Xinjiang.
Yes.
So can we get started on that? Tell us about what it was like, when you went, how it was, anything you want to share. You're muted.
I'd ask everybody, once the COVID restrictions are over, and of course, if one can do it financially, to go and visit Xinjiang for themselves, to see whether I or Fiona is correct, or whether the Globe and Mail or the New York Times is correct. I think that's the first thing. If they can. I traveled to China on my own money, on my own time, and I made all the arrangements myself. I didn't go through a guided tour. I didn't go there with the delegation. I booked my tickets. I booked my train tickets, plane tickets, hotels in China on my computer, through my cell phone. And so that's important to sort of note. Secondly, that when I was in Xinjiang, both 1 week in Urumqi, the capital, and 1 week in Kashgar, I was not accompanied by any minders. I traveled within the cities by myself on the streetcar, by buses, by taxis, by foot. And so that's also important to note, that there were no restrictions. I took many pictures, which some I will share. Yeah, so that's kind of the background as to how I ended up and what I did in Xinjiang.
Mm-hmm. And Omar, do you think, I'm just going to actually, you know what? Actually, apologies. Before that, Fiona, can you just talk a little bit about some of your experiences that you've been having around getting out other information, particularly around China?
Yeah, so are you able to hear me all right, just
Yeah.
before I begin?
Yeah,
Perfect.
yeah, we're good.
So back in, I believe it was 2018, 2019, I was getting, very frustrated by the amount of coverage on Xinjiang, China, because it was clearly very biased. It was all one-sided, and I wanted to personally, on a personal level, find out more as well before I would disseminate any sort of propaganda. There's always this notion that when it comes to pro-China people, China supporters, whatever you want to call us, that we just blindly, believe whatever the state says, whatever China says, we believe. But in actual fact, part of my own formation of opinions on China has been through thorough investigation of a multitude of different sources. And yes, a lot of them are from Chinese publications, because at the end of the day, Xinjiang is part of China. There's no denying that. So I did set up a Google Doc, which was up for about about a year and a half, a year and a bit, using just Google Docs. And it was just like, literally, there was no for or against, there was no you must believe this. It was just a document with maybe a few hundred links linking to different sources on Xinjiang, ranging from, what are some of the commonly spread myths about what's going on in Xinjiang, to what's the context of the area, to what the international response is to China. Now, this should be a fairly, neutral document, in my opinion, because it was just, all it was just dumping links there. People could go and research them as they pleased. However, I believe it was last summer, a mass of people, I presume, decided to mass report the document, and it got taken down. Of course, that was just like, it was totally expected at that point. I made another document, but then that also on Google Docs, that very, very quickly also got taken down. And I believe there was a third time that I did actually try to put the document back up with all these resources that were being updated every couple of months. But again, this also got taken down. So in my 3 attempts to provide resources, alternative resources, you could say, on what's going on in Xinjiang, China, they've been essentially censored by Western states every time, by Google, the conglomerate Google. So it's quite interesting when people say that China censors everything, that China is censoring information. However, since then, the new document has now been hosted on, a Chinese platform. And ironically, for all of China's censorship rules, it's been up for a very long time. It comes from my IP address here in the UK. I've had no issues with it. It is all in Chinese, but that's really the only hindrance to English speakers who would be looking for access to that document. But again, it's quite funny.
You also have this link that Kiran actually shared with me that gives very specific directions on how to access, using the Chinese characteristics, where to click, and it's quite a maze, actually. It is a bit of a maze, but it's very smart that you've done that, because there is a way then for people to access this wealth of resources that you've accumulated and compiled for people, and I think that that's important too. So, Omar, if I could ask you what some of the claims that you've been hearing are, and what are your thoughts on them? So we have claims, for instance, about the genocide claim, okay? And then we, there's a couple other claims, but let's start there.
Right. So when the Canadian Parliament adopted that resolution on the 22nd of March, they actually used the word genocide. Genocide, as I've written in my articles, has a very simple definition. the mass killing of a people, of a race, of a group. And it's happened many times. I think Kiran pointed out, or you pointed out, that in the Americas, the Aboriginal people, the indigenous people, they were wiped out. Nazi Germany tried to wipe out the Jews as a group. In Indonesia in 1965, the right-wing generals, they killed almost 1 million people. 1 million people, ethnically Chinese, who they said or thought they were members of the Communist Party of Indonesia. So I was sort of keen to look at what's happening in Xinjiang between 2010 and 2018.
Mm-hmm.
The Uyghur population has gone up by 25%, from 10.17 million to 12 million people, while the Han population, the Han Chinese population in Xinjiang, has gone up only 2%. So
what does that mean then, Omar? Like when you're saying that, so this is kind of evidence that if there was actually a genocide, then why is the population growing? You know, like just in plain speak. Like I think this is something that's super important to look at and acknowledge.
I would have thought so, that, like, you know, if there had been massive killing of the Uyghur people, then their population would have tended to show a decrease. And it is not so. Their population has increased. But that is not the only definition of genocide. I mean, the United Nations has many aspects of it, and I'd be happy to discuss those also.
Yeah. Yes, for sure. Kiran, do you have some thoughts around what Omar just mentioned, or Fiona's document, for instance? Because you were the one who shared that with me. You're like, you got to check this out. You know, like, go here, check it out. So, do you have some thoughts that you'd like to share?
Yeah. Basically, you know, I personally would love to go to Xinjiang. And when Omar was going, I was thinking, oh my God, I wish I was going to. I remember that. And then I couldn't wait till he came back and gave us a report on that. So I would love to go. It's you know, I've been to China myself, and a couple of times. Most recently in 2018, I was there as part of the International Day of Peace, a delegation for the International Day of Peace. So, you know, some of the things that I want our audience to know about is that, you know, you might already know some of these things, but for example, you know, China has a population of 1.4 billion people, and the US has a population of about 330 million. Canada's population is about 33 million. And out of 1.4 billion people, China lifted 800 million people out of poverty. Meanwhile, 4.9 million people in Canada are living in poverty, living in extreme poverty. And in the US, I think the number is around 18 million, if I'm not mistaken. And 18.5 million. Yeah. Meanwhile, China, during the COVID pandemic, has had about 5,000 deaths. Now, even if you don't trust that number, even if, let's say, you know, whatever, but 5,000 deaths is what's, I think that there's probably been more deaths around the world than have been reported. I don't think it's just one country, but you know, what's the official death toll is 5,000. They were the first ones to identify the virus and notify the WHO and the world by sharing the DNA of the virus, and which helped, you know, formulate the vaccines that we're seeing now. So China's death, after a 1.4 billion population, COVID deaths were 5,000. The US has had over 500,000 deaths. And so, you know, with 1/3 the population, less than 1/3. So we're seeing that China is doing things right, a lot of things right, but we're not really seeing that kind of narrative in the media. You know, so I think that we need to kind of look at what what the narrative that we're being told in the West, and what Fiona's talking about, for example, is the censorship that we're seeing. Even if you even for this event, we couldn't make a Facebook event for this page, for this event that you're watching right now, because Facebook would not let us make an event. You cannot make an event.
I tried on all my tech stuff, and it's like, no, I can't. Why can't I make an event?
Yeah. Moxie was messaging me and saying what's happening, and I was like, no matter how she worded it, she wasn't able to make an event for it. And there's probably some keywords that throw it off. So there's quite a lot of censorship that we're seeing on online media, as well as, of course, traditional media is not even they're not even pretending to be neutral in any way. So we need to really think about why we are being inundated with this propaganda, with this anti-China, constant anti-China barrage, and it's really leading up to some kind of war, and it's really scary.
Well, that is what's scary, though. It's that it does feel like there's like this massive looming threat, about war.
And the wars these days are fought under the presumption of humanitarianism. This is how this is how the powers that be prep us for these kinds of wars. They did that with Iraq, where they they told us there was weapons of mass destruction. They did that with Libya, where they said Gaddafi was giving his soldiers Viagra to go and commit mass rapes.
Right.
All of these things were proven to be wrong. And what we have to recognize is that we are being emotionally manipulated by the media to give our consent. They're trying to manufacture consent, literally. And I think that we need to kind of look at that. We need to kind of keep that in mind.
Omar, you were going to say something? Yeah.
No.
Were you going to comment? Okay. Yeah.
I was just going to say that.
Uh-oh.
Omar, you're freezing. Hello? Okay, you're freezing right now, so I'm good. Oh, you're back. Okay, sorry. Go for it, Omar. What were you going to say? Sorry.
So one of the charges that Western governments, Western media has laid on China has been that China has put 1 million Uyghurs, or 2 million Uyghurs, or 3 million Uyghurs in jail. The population of Ottawa, the population of Calgary is 1 million people.
That's a lot of people. That's like
the population of Montreal City, the population of Manhattan is 1.6 million people. Just imagine the number of buildings that would be required to hold 1 million, 1.5 million, or 2 million people, right?
Yes.
They tell us that they have satellite cameras so powerful that they can read a license plate on Earth. So then why on earth can't they show us pictures of the courtyards, of these details of these prisons? What they show us is 1 or 2 pictures only of a high wall, of a turret, of some barbed wire. That's something. So I would urge people that even this figure of 1 million people, they should look at Ajit and Norton's article that no, the UN did not say that there was 1 million Uyghurs in jails. It's Googleable. And they explain how the West came up with this figure. One US woman making a comment to the United Nations Human Rights Committee without any proof whatsoever, and they ran with that story. So just lie and lie and lie as big as possible. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. Thank you. And thanks for mentioning that, because that's that moment too, Kiran, where it's like, boy, that would require a lot of infrastructure and a lot of just resources, period, to in prison, all over 1 million people. And Omar's right. The number is, I have seen different numbers. And Fiona, can you speak to a little bit to that? But also there's some other important claims that maybe Kiran and Fiona can talk about, and possibly break down some of those myths too, the way, in a similar way that Omar did with the concentration camp.
Yeah, so on the whole question of the concentration camps, I think something that's quite interesting is that obviously there's arguments that, there are satellite images of prison compounds, but if you actually look into them, there's some great threads on Twitter, for example, just by everyday users who have pointed out that a lot of these maps, these images, they just come from Google Maps. It's just someone taking a screenshot of a bird's eye view of a school, of a shop, of, yes, a prison, as prisons do exist in pretty much every state in the world, and claiming it is a concentration camp with no evidence to back it up, with no live data, with essentially no credible information. And I feel like it's pretty amazing, to be honest, how easy it is to be able to disseminate propaganda on China that isn't backed up by evidence, that isn't backed up by statistical data, that isn't backed up by anything scientific whatsoever. So you get ideologues such as what's his name, the one on Twitter, CJ Warman, and I remember this very, very distinctly. I think it was 2018. He posted a video and it showed some Chinese aunties drinking and laughing and just dancing, having a good time. Objectively, from the video, that's all you could see. However, the caption he put was something like, "Look at this. The Chinese are forcing Uyghur Muslims to drink alcohol and dance for them as they watch." Now, obviously, in any other situation, this would be laughable. You can't just take a video and project whatever you feel it is or project what you want it to be onto it. However, for some reason, because CJ Warman has some sort of authority as a journalist, quote unquote, this went viral, and since then he's upped the ante. He has basically pushed the boundaries on how bizarre and how absurd you can make claims about China whilst still having people believe you. I think another one was Chinese New Year, for example, and he posted a video, and there was there was a lot of noise in the air, and he claimed, "Oh, this is Uyghur Muslims in the concentration camp being executed." And obviously that's horrific, right? That's a horrific claim to make. If there was a video of this, like, it should go viral. However, this video was taken on TikTok. It was quite clearly taken on TikTok, and in fact, it was simply a video of some people who had gone to venerate their ancestors. I think it was on the 12th day of Chinese New Year, and they were setting off firecrackers as a way to say goodbye as the Spring Festival Chinese New Year closed. And yet, people in their droves and their thousands and millions on places like Twitter, Facebook, I even saw this on YouTube, was spreading this like wildfire, saying that these are people getting shot live on camera. Wow. Why is no one doing anything about this? And it's so insulting. It's so pathetic that there's so much xenophobia, especially in the West, that there's anything of China, positive as it can be, it will be distorted to the nth degree, and turned into something disgusting and horrible and a crime against humanity, as we've already discussed.
Well, yeah. I was just going to say on that, I think that's actually deliberate. I think that our governments and our media don't want us to look at China as a model. China has put down thousands and thousands of kilometers of high-speed rail that crisscrosses the entire country at this point. A lot of it is running on renewable energy. A lot of it is driverless and things like that. And they're entire cities that are using driverless buses and renewable buses that run on renewable energy. There's a lot of really positive technological and sociocultural stuff coming out of China that our government in the Canada, in the US, they don't want us to know about these things. They don't want us to demand these things of our governments, and therefore they want to kind of end the conversation. No matter what you say, if you say anything positive about China, but Xinjiang, that's it. You're done. You're not allowed to say anything that China's doing anything positive. Lifting 800 million people out of poverty is not a small feat. this is not a joke. And you know what? I saw a little tiny bit of that when I was there in 2018. I saw the huts that used to the mud huts that people used to live in with no running water and things like that. And now they have roads, they have internet, they have electricity, decent housing, schools, medical centers in the same villages. And these are things that we are not allowed to know about. We're not allowed to acknowledge them. We're not allowed to be happy for China. We're not allowed to ask for these things here, where our people are, people here in the West are getting poorer and poorer. There are millions of people unemployed, millions being evicted every day. And we're not supposed to, we're not supposed to have anything to look up to.
And, this is the other thing, Kiran, is like sometimes when you are trying to sort of combat all of this disinformation and plow through, wade through like what's real, what isn't, because it does get difficult. It does get to become a lot of work to figure it out, right? Which is why doing these kinds of panels, like I want to encourage everybody on the anti-imperialist left to get out there and start talking about this like all the time. It's really important that we have to, we combat these kind of disinformation, show the things that are factual versus, the propaganda. Because there is propaganda, there's no question, and blatant lies too, as Fiona pointed out, like just blatant lies, and or what is it, like hyperbole, and maybe that's a good word for some of the other things too. But I'm losing my train of thought a little bit, but I just wanted to.
Can I?
Yeah, jump in for sure. Yeah. Thank you for saving me. Go for it.
Right. So, like as best as I could, I've tried to answer the question of a physical genocide of the Uyghur people. I've tried to answer the question of are there a million Uyghurs in jails? Both, I think, are extremely improbable. The third charge that the Western media makes is that China is demolishing mosques in Xinjiang. If you look up, if you Google it, you'll find that there are 24,000 mosques in Xinjiang. And for China to destroy one or two or three, what would it gain China to destroy a few mosques? It would gain unremitting hostility from the Uyghur people if their places of worship were being destroyed. I asked a woman there, I said, is this true? And she said, laughingly, and she says, you know what? We are not Pakistan or we are not India, where mosques or temples are routinely demolished. This is China. We believe in a secular state. We believe in allowing people to have their places of worship. And I saw many, many mosques myself. And as I say again, people can go and look themselves up themselves.
Well, yeah, actually, not only are there 24,000 mosques in Xinjiang, that's over 10 times the number of mosques in the US. Okay. And it also means that there are actually 530 there's a mosque for 530 Muslims in Xinjiang, basically. So about every 500 Muslims, there's a mosque, which is more than in most countries in the world. So there's a lot of mosques in Xinjiang. This whole narrative of, oh, China's destroying mosques, it literally is completely based in fiction. It's not true at all.
And sorry. And why they are doing this, of course, is, I think you pointed it out, that the hundreds of mosques that they have destroyed through saturation bombing of cities in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, in Afghanistan, and they want to divert attention from those to alleged demolition of mosques in Xinjiang.
Yeah.
This is another thing about projection. The Canadian Parliament voted unanimously. That includes the NDP, the Greens, the Bloc Québécois. Everybody voted unanimously to condemn China and the genocide in China. But you know what? They have never voted unanimously on any other fucking thing. They would never vote unanimously to condemn the genocide that Canada is committing on Canada's Indigenous people. The genocide, the fact that we're living on this land that has been stolen from the Indigenous people in Canada and what's now Canada and the US. They would never condemn the rates of incarceration of Black and Indigenous people in the United States and Canada and in the jail systems here. They would never condemn the way the police target Black people, target Indigenous people. They would never unanimously condemn any of this in the Canadian Parliament, but they're going to go out of their way to unanimously condemn this supposed genocide that has no evidence, that is based on the testimony of one German fanatic named Adrian Zenz. Let's talk about Adrian Zenz. Fiona, do you have something to tell us about who Adrian Zenz is?
Yes, so much to tell about Adrian Zenz.
And I feel like this is like one of the only sources that Western media is using. So, is him, which is crackers. Go for it, Fiona.
So, I mean, there's so much to say about him, but in a nutshell, he is a far-right ideologue who has explicitly said in his own text, in his own books, that he believes he has been sent by God on a mission to destroy communism, to destroy communist China and save the world from its plights. Among that, obviously, he is deeply anti-Semitic, with some horrible passages about people who are not Christians, evangelical Christians, who will burn in hell. And we all know the implications of what that means for Jewish people, for Muslim people, for anyone who isn't a Christian. And the fact of the matter is, the last time he went to Xinjiang for a visit was in 2007 and 2008. So since then, he has not even been to the region. And yet he claims to be an expert. And how does he claim to be an expert when he does not speak Mandarin, he does not speak Cantonese, he does not speak the Uyghur language? He speaks German, English, possibly. But all he does is he hires people to translate some sources he finds from Chinese state websites, and then he projects his own findings onto them. This is the least scientific way you can go about interpreting and analyzing data. Yes.
And to that point too, and yes, Omar, I'm just going to make a point about the gray zone. I was reading some of their China documentation and the research that they've been doing on that to sort of debunk and get rid of some of the myths as well. And they mentioned that a lot of the footnotes, his so-called academic footnotes and research, is full of holes, like a ton of holes. And it hasn't even been peer reviewed. This academic research that all of these Western governments are using as fact has never even been peer reviewed. That's whoa, right? So, Omar, go for it.
I think many people now understand that the Western media, Western governments lie. But many people, even on the left, will say, well, all right, but what about testimony from people, from Uyghurs, who say that they have witnessed these things? I can't deny that everything is what they're saying is lying. But here's the thing: testimony from political refugees is bound to be very, very biased because they're making a case for their views. I'll give you one example from Iraq. There was a political refugee who came out to the West. I have the exact quote somewhere, and he said that Uday Hussein, Saddam's son, or Saddam had a human shredding machine where he would put opponents into it and they would be shredded like paper, and Uday, his son, would love to do that. I mean, I think we should be very, very careful in accepting the testimony from political refugees. We've seen them from North Korea, etc., etc. To give you one example, there is a charge that in these jails, China, as a matter of policy, forcibly sterilizes Uyghur women. Let me ask all the audience that for 40 years, from 1978 to 2017, China had a one-child policy, right?
Mm.
China never applied this policy to national minorities like the Uyghurs, like the Tibetans, like the Inner Mongolians, etc. Why would now China try to limit their population? The Uyghur population is 12 million at the most, even with the 25% increase over the past 9 years or so. But 12 million people is only 0.8% of the China's 1.4 billion. Why, in heaven's name, that China never applied the one-child policy to them? They're only 0.8% of the population. Why would China forcibly sterilize women there? It is projection. Canada has sterilized indigenous women in numbers, and so they're simply projecting this. I don't think it's reasonable to believe that China would be doing it. What purpose could it serve?
Yeah.
Well, I think that what purpose I think that there's a psychology behind this projection, which basically is that the West is kind of really it's having to face its colonial past and present. And I think they're projecting this onto China because they don't want to be the only ones to have done all these horrible things. They want to believe that we are not the only ones who did these horrible things. Look, everybody does it. You know, they really need to believe that China is just as bad in every way, or maybe even worse, you know, and that way they can exonerate themselves, the Western, you know, settler colonial type of, you know, the powers that be. They need to exonerate themselves. And I think that's one of the reasons why all this is happening. Another thing.
Put up that picture that I took of
sure, yeah.
families with
Sure, I'll put that up. I also wanted to point out that China actually has 55 ethnic minorities. And, you know, I don't think the US even counts how many there are. Like, they usually are like, okay, you know, you go to one of those forums and it's like, you know, it's not counted as much. You know, there's just this lack of accountability in the US and Canada. But China has 55 ethnic minorities, out of which 10 are predominantly Muslim. So 10 of 55 ethnic minorities in China are predominantly Muslim. The Uyghurs are not the only Muslims in China. There's the Hui Muslims, there's the Kazakhs, the Uzbeks, and a whole bunch of others. So why are we if China was so hell-bent against Muslims, why would they only be going after Uyghurs and not after the 9 other ethnic minorities that are Muslims?
And I just want to point out too that, you know, the United States, I'm sorry, you're all of a sudden you care about Muslims in the world? Like, really? I'm sorry. Like, when, like, it's just such a hypocritical. It's so filled with hypocrisy. And when you're trying to be skeptical about the claims that are coming out about China, so say on social media, for instance, you're trying to be skeptical and you're trying to go, but what about this? What about this? Now it's being called whataboutism. If this isn't about whataboutism, well, yes, it is actually. Yes, it should be. It should be about, like, let's look at all of these things. It's important to look at the history and the hypocrisy of the West. You know, it just is. And it just drives me crazy when people try to shut you down when you point those things out. So this is the picture. Do you want to explain what that is?
These are some of the
Omar?
pictures by Omar. Yeah. Omar, you're muted.
So I don't know if people can see this or not. It was the second day of Eid, and there are 3, there's a mom, there's 3 daughters. This and this is also a Uyghur family of 4 children. This is also a family of Uyghurs with 4 children. Yeah. This, even today, I have traveled to China twice, once for 7 weeks in 2013 and 2014, again completely on my own, and now. This you would not see of any Han family. One child is it. Maybe very rarely two, but this site you would not see at all. Which brings me to the second point, and which interested me very much. I'm not a believer myself, but I work in the Pakistani Canadian community uh, where a lot of people are Muslims. And one of the things that the West says is that people in Xinjiang, men, are not allowed to have beards. I took many, many pictures of men with beards. There's 3. These are 2 men talking.
Mm.
Both have beards. This is an older man having a beard. Yeah, I don't think people can see it, but if they can, and this is another man who is standing and who has also a beard. Many, many such sites. The thing was, of course, that it was usually middle-aged or older men who had the beards, but not. I didn't see many younger people. Only one young male having a beard. But this is completely untrue. That Uyghur Muslim men are not allowed to wear beards.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, and Fiona, too, you wanted to mention something, speaking of claims that, there's oppression around Muslim traditional practices with men and not having beards, shave your beard. But there's also some stuff around women's liberation claims. So did you want to speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think particularly in the West recently, over the past few months, I've noticed there's been a big push, not necessarily away from claims of the oppression of Uyghur Muslims, but specifically the oppression of Uyghur Muslim women in China. So the claims of, as Omar has already mentioned, from forced sterilization to, restricting the amount of children you can have, to, women experiencing, obviously trigger warning for sexual abuse within educational training centers. And now it's very interesting that this has come up during a time where China's poverty alleviation campaigns have been focusing on impoverished areas in Xinjiang, which historically have meant that women in particular have suffered to the detriment of not being able to have opportunities to work outside the household, to not have skills training, education that they would have otherwise had there been, other opportunities, whether it's jobs or schools in the local area that they were able to attend. And so a part of China's big poverty alleviation push is women's empowerment, is the liberation of women, because as you know, this Chinese state is by no means perfect in terms of gender equality. Like, there is no state in the world that is perfect. That's, we're all working towards women's liberation. However, part of the focus has been, in order to empower women, in order to liberate women from the shackles of patriarchy, and as well as obviously white supremacy, it is that to give women the freedom to be able to have access to education, to training, to healthcare, to just even freedom to choose who they want to marry, to how many children they want to have, which has not been an option for a multitude of years, because healthcare has not always been accessible, particularly in rural parts of Xinjiang. So the fact that there has been an increase in IUDs that women have been taking, and contraception that women have been taking, is not indicative of, the oppressive Chinese state trying to curb births of Uyghur women. It's more in the fact that, women are now able to access birth control, contraception, that they would not have been able to before. They are now able to have more autonomy over their bodies, over how many children they wish to raise, how many yeah, just in terms of even controlling their family size. In addition to this, is obviously more routes for women to go into education, whether that is skills training in vocational training centers, which have been ultimately, demonized by the West, painted as, these concentration camps where apparently women dance and sing and learn to write and paint and learn technical skills. This is the strangest concentration camp I've ever heard of, if I've ever heard of one. And again, it's all this propaganda that's, again, it's just a normal thing. It is a normal thing in the West. How long and how much propaganda, in a sense, just propaganda in a neutral way, is there for to family planning, to stay safe, to have protected sex. It's no different to that, if anything. However, it's being turned around and turned into this thing where, again, it is a sign of oppression. The most normal, mundane things, not even mundane, to be honest, because it is, about the liberation of women, but something positive is turned around into something horrible. And yes, there are schools where women can attend to increase their technical skills, and these often are far away, and they are boarding schools for the most part, because a lot of people in Xinjiang, they live in very rural areas which are separated from the urban centers, which means they do have to travel far to go to school, and the commute back and forth just wouldn't be worth it in a day. So many women choose to, or are offered the opportunity to go and study in a vocational skills center. Well, they'll stay during the week, and then they'll come home for the weekends, or they'll stay for a term or a season and then come back to their families after that. And again, this is a common occurrence. Boarding schools really aren't alien to China, to Chinese migrants, and they aren't alien to the global South. Like, a lot of people will go and stay at boarding schools because it is the more accessible, cheaper option for families who live in rural areas. But yeah, that was my little rant on.
No, I think that, no, this is important to show and to highlight. Yeah.
So I have traveled in many Muslim countries, Morocco and Egypt, even Turkey, and of course Pakistan, Afghanistan even. And one of the fascinating things about China, for me at least, was it's not something, it isn't very startling for something in North America, in Western Europe, but for a country which is coming from the, has an ex-colonial past, a very strong patriarchal condition. I love to travel by train, and I took as many long trains, short train rides as I could, even from Beijing to North Korea. I took a train, although it cost me 2 days, but I wanted to see things. In China, unlike in Egypt or Turkey or anywhere else that I've traveled to, at least, the overnight trains have either booths, whatever you call them, carriages, with cabins for 4 people or 6 people, sleepers. And women and men share those cabins. It's unthinkable in a Muslim society. There are so many aspects of women's liberation in China that I think we should pay attention to, although I still think that there is continuing patriarchy to a certain extent. Which brings me to another point, and I think you might have a slide. People, or a picture, people tell us that Uyghur Muslims are not allowed to fast. It's one of the important religious rights of Muslims, of believers. The first question that you should ask is, how would you force a population not to fast? Would you force feed them? I happened to be there during the very last days of Ramadan. This picture here is taken on the 29th of May, and you can see that people are eating. And in other places, I saw thousands and thousands of Uyghurs. I both in Urumqi and in Kashgar, I lived in areas which were heavily Uyghur areas. And so if you go down a bit, you will see people eating here during Ramadan. If you look at this picture even further down, that Uyghurs are force-fed pork. These are halal meat shops. I asked a Uyghur, are you forced to eat pork? And they really looked at me in disbelief. They laughed in disbelief at the stupidity of the question. You've heard that people say that, oh, Muslim, you Uyghur women are not allowed to have to wear the headscarf. This picture, many other pictures where women are wearing headscarves. School children, 30% of children in schools, school age going children in Pakistan, a Muslim country close to China, they do not go to school. You saw anywhere, you go to Mexico, you go to Panama, you go to Egypt or whatever, you see many small children doing labor in stores, in fields, or begging. In China, I never saw that. If it exists, I don't know. I think that what I'm told, what I saw was that 100% children go to school. Yep.
Yeah.
And isn't this called, I just wanted to ask too, because this is something that I think is important to kind of clarify for folks. Like Kiran mentioned earlier that China is very proudly diverse. Like they talk a lot about the diversity in China, right, Fiona? But there's also, they have a few autonomous regions, and the Uyghur region being called Uyghur Autonomous Region. What does that mean? So can you speak a little bit to why is it called an autonomous region? Like, what does that mean?
Before we go there, can I just have a little minute to rant?
Oh yeah, bring it, rant. There's lots to rant about.
I want to go back to the whole women's autonomy thing, as considering it's Women's Day in a couple of days. I think we need to highlight that. I think we need to question why the West, which wants women's rights and secularism here for us, for people living in the West, thinks that those same things are oppression when China does it. We need to ask why we want birth control and access to abortion and IUDs as women living here, or as women identified people living here. But somehow that is considered to be oppression of women in other countries, in China particularly. So we need to ask, Argentina literally just decriminalized abortion, and we should be celebrating that. Meanwhile, Poland has banned abortion, and we should be fighting against that. And when China has extended or made it easier for Uyghur women or women in Xinjiang to do more family planning, birth control, and things like that, Planned Parenthood. You know how Planned Parenthood is something all these Westerners love? When China does it, supposedly that's oppressing Uyghur women? I don't think so. Why don't Westerners want Muslim women to have autonomy? That's my question.
I'm so glad you did that rant. That was perfect.
Just needed to get that out of the system.
Yes. Fiona, did you want to make any comments? Fiona?
Yeah, I mean, just on that note, 100%. I think something as well that's important to note is that with these poverty alleviation campaigns, and even with the vocational skills training, part of it has meant that in Xinjiang, I was just reading it's called the Social Responsibility Report, and it's about the cotton textile industry in Xinjiang specifically, which has had a massive boom over the years. And they have had an influx of female workers, many of them Uyghur. And part of the corporate social responsibility of a lot of these companies hiring workers, employees, whatever, is not only to pay them a fair wage, which is above the minimum wage, and many of them pay 10 times more than that depending on skills. It's that they provide facilities for women to be able to have a balanced family life, because again, it is patriarchy is is the thing. You can't just wave it away with a magic wand. So women are still, you know, the dominant caregivers for their children. So part of these initiatives have included, you know, making sure there's a creche nearby, making sure there are daycare centers nearby, where during the workday women can go in, check on their children, they can breastfeed their babies if they so wish. But ultimately, there is, you know, state funded or privately funded, depending on the company, care of children. So women do not have the burden of having to physically care for their children 24/7, whilst also having to work and balance homemaking and everything like that. And another part of the education system, which I found quite interesting with poverty alleviation programs, is also teaching men as well the skills to be able to support their wives in the homestead. So the burden isn't entirely on women to, you know, to look after and micromanage the household, the kids, and work and do this and do that. And to be honest, I find that incredible, because even here in the West, how many women in particular, how many families struggle, single parent households especially, with getting childcare, because you have to, in many parts of the UK, there's only a certain number of hours of free childcare you can get a week. The rest you have to pay, you know, hundreds of pounds a week just for your child to have somewhere to stay and play and have food during the day, which I find horrific in, you know, a first world nation that is built on the pillaging of wealth from every single nation on this planet. It's ridiculous. And yet China's women having access to this is a bad thing. It means they're being separated from their children. It means they're being, you know, children are being imprisoned away from their parents. It's distorted into such horrible things.
And that those kinds of nuances, right? Like how you can put out a picture of, you know, these so-called, you know, this a Google Maps picture of, like, you know, anywhere in the world, and say this is concentration camps in China. You know, you can call, you know, like you just pointed out about the daycares, like, oh, this is, you know, China doing this to women. So this really is kind of an information war at this point, right? So, and I wanted to kind of get into that a little bit. You know, Kiran, I think, you know, the idea of this Cold War, right? I know the Communist Party of Canada is calling it a Cold War, and a lot of other people on the anti-imperialist left are calling it a Cold War. So what are your thoughts? I'm going to throw this out to you guys. What are your thoughts about this being a Cold War, given everything we've just talked about today? Omar?
I think that we should have some questions from the audience, but just one last point from me, that it is said by the Western media that the Uyghur language is being suppressed in Xinjiang. So I don't know. I have another picture to show. People can go and see for themselves. I, with my own two little eyes, I saw signage. No, it's the next one. This one. Again, if you see this, this one, if you could enlarge this. This is a picture of a woman. She could well have been a Han woman. These two children, I was trying to get her attention, but of course she wouldn't let me take her picture. And there's a young one trying to peer over the handlebars. Behind here, you will see all these signs in both languages, Mandarin and the Uyghur language, which is based on Arabic, which I can read. I got into the taxi, and here is this information, both in Mandarin and in Uyghur. This is, if you go down a bit, this is the train station. I believe in Urumqi. No, to the right. This one. This has the signage in 3 languages: English, Mandarin, and Turkic or Uyghur. And if you see this picture to the left here, this is the Bank of China, and it is in the Uyghur language also. I heard the language spoken by Uyghurs. Oh, the restaurant, it's in Mandarin and in Uyghur. The woman out there that you can not see probably is wearing a headscarf. And this old ancient Kashgar, which they are rebuilding, is also in 3 languages. Really, I can't reiterate enough how people should go and have a look for themselves to see if the Western media, if Western governments are lying or telling the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So, having said those things, I was hoping that we could allow we'd have some time for questions to come in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if anybody has questions for our guests or for Moxie and me on this topic, please do post them in the YouTube chat. We'd be happy to take any good questions that come up, anything that you're curious about. This is a good time. We have one person who is an expert on this topic, Fiona, who has done a lot of research and reading on this topic, and of course Omar, who also has done a lot of reading and also has been there physically. And I think that thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. I've been looking forward to this particular panel discussion for a while, and so thank you. I also want to mention a little bit about the way that, I think, Moxie, you mentioned how come all of a sudden the West cares about Muslims. The United States and Canada alongside, have been attacking Afghanistan for a long time, but most recently, since 2001. And then they've been in the US has been in Iraq since 2002, I believe, or 2003. And I mean, that was just the third or fourth time that they've been there. And so the United States has a long history, and Canada as its little brother, helping it along. The West has a long history of going after Muslims all over the world, attacking Muslim countries, destroying Muslim countries, whether it's Iraq, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, going and, putting up military dictators in places like Pakistan and stuff like that. All of a sudden, they care about Muslims in Xinjiang. And the thing is that most of the Muslim countries, all the Muslim countries in the world, have actually stood by China on this issue. And it's the countries that have actually denounced China are all countries that are aligned with the US. They're all Western countries. They're all colonial countries. None of the countries that are outside of that sphere have actually said anything negative about the way that China is handling the situation in Xinjiang. I also we're starting to get some questions in. Thank you. Please keep them coming. We're going to make a list of questions and attend to them. I also wanted to talk about the situation in Xinjiang in terms of the extremism that was seen there since 1990. As some of our, go ahead, Omar, do you want to chime in?
No, that's a question. Maybe Fiona wants to answer it too. And I have a bit, the final sort of picture that I think I might have sent to you. Security in Xinjiang, at least what I noticed, is far stricter in Xinjiang than in other cities of China. It's normal anywhere to have those metal detectors in airports or in railway stations or where people gather in vast numbers. In Xinjiang, I noticed that there were metal detectors even in the hotel, in hotel entrances, and many commercial stores, etc. too. As I said before, that I could travel within Urumqi and Kashgar freely, openly, but intercity travel. I went to 3 long trips outside the cities, one in the Pamir Mountains, one to the Kalamatan desert, and one to a lake, Heavenly Lake. And I had to get special permit for that. And there were checkpoints on the way. And I asked the reason for that. And they said precisely that we were faced with terrorism, and we want to prevent that as much as possible. And the third thing that it was very noticeable, or it was at least noticeable, was that when cars went into the gas stations, it isn't so in any other city, in China that I saw, anyways, cars were checked for explosives. But you can imagine that if a car loaded with dynamite was exploded in a gas station, the amount of danger it could pose. So I don't know, Kiran, if you have that fourth slide showing the bush with the Uyghur.
I don't have that particular one. I know which one you're
yeah.
referring to. If you want to send it to me, I can put it up.
Yeah, maybe
If you
I
have
will be able to. But just a very quick note. People will know that the United States heavily backed the Afghan Mujahideen, the counter-revolutionary Mujahideen, right? People know that the United States has been backing Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, Daesh in Syria, in Iraq, right? And similarly, there has been this East Turkestan Islamic movement, which wants to set up an Islamic caliphate first in East Turkestan, which is Xinjiang, and then all of Central Asia. And so here's the picture. This is Reagan meeting with the Taliban, with the Mujahideen representatives. And Reagan actually likened them to the founding fathers of the United States. And as I said, the United States has also, funded other terrorist movements. And here is the East Turkestan Islamic movement. It was founded in the 1990s. It was very quickly listed by China as a terrorist organization and by the United Nations Security Council. The United States supported it. But finally, after 2001, the attacks on the Twin Towers, the United States agreed to list them as a terrorist organization too. Here is a picture of George Bush with the leaders of the World Uyghur Congress, which is sort of the civilian front of the East Turkestan Islamic movement. People should think about it. How many US presidents will have their pictures taken with representatives of, let's say, the Palestinian Liberation Movement? They never would. And finally, this, that on October the 20th, just as the Trump administration was going on its way out, there is this memorandum that acting under the authority of section this, that, and the other, I revoke the designation of the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement, known as ETEM, as a terrorist organization, signed October 20th, Michael Pompeo, the Secretary of State. This double standard, this arming, funding of extremists, of fundamentalist organizations, and I'll tell you something, it'll come and bite them in the ass again, as the Mujahideen did, as Al-Qaeda and others are doing it in Iraq and Syria.
Yeah, I actually think the ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which Omar has just been talking about, it's now calling itself the Turkestan Islamic Party. I believe they've rebranded. The Turkestan Islamic Party. They were formed basically in 1990. They were modeled after the Taliban and the Mujahideen, which later the Taliban grew out of the Mujahideen. They were three bombings in 1997. The first one was actually a riot in 1990. Then there were three bombings in Urumqi, which is part of Xinjiang. Then there was a beheading in Balochistan in Pakistan, which the ETIM was responsible for. Then there were attacks on various attacks, bus attacks and car attacks on civilians. There was in July 2010, Norway interrupted a terrorist bomb plot. One of the perpetrators was an extremist from Xinjiang. And there were several attacks in 2011 in Xinjiang that were claimed by the Turkestan Islamic Party. There was a suicide attack in Tiananmen Square in October 2013 that caused 5 deaths and 38 injuries. There were knife attacks, just people just would go around slashing people at the Kunming railway station in March 2014. Then in July 2014.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
39 people died in the
Yeah.
Kunming.
Yeah. There's these videos. You can actually look it up. We'll post a link to a video that has video footage of these attacks happening. There was between July and December 2014, there were a series of bombings, riots, arson, and knife attacks in Xinjiang, which led to the deaths of 183 people, including civilians. So what I'm saying is that there have been attacks, and these are the attacks that have been fueled by this Wahhabi strain of jihadi Islam. You know, it's not the real Islam. It's actually a very fascistic far right-wing form of jihad. It's called Wahhabism. So it's you know, we have seen this kind of Islamic extremism or whatever they call it. I don't even like that term, to be honest. I think it should be called Wahhabism because it's not really Islam. It's a offshoot of some kind. But we've seen that in ISIS. These are the same people. In fact, some of the extremists out of the Xinjiang area were fighting with ISIS in Syria, where they were with ISIS. They were embedded with ISIS. And the United States, as Omar said, taking ETIM, East Turkestan Islamic Movement, off the terrorist list it shows their double standard, considering they've been fighting them. The United States has been fighting them, but you know, now that they're a threat to China, it's the United States takes them off the list.
Yeah. You know, and God forbid that, you know, China tries to protect its sovereign interests as well, and you know, prevent sort of you know, extremism or violence from taking place within its own borders and territory, right? United States could look after herself, but nobody else can. There is some questions. I think maybe this last one I'm going to throw out to you all from June. There are some on the left that like to compare the situation in Xinjiang to the U.S. war on terror and the U.S.'s invasion of Iraq. Do you believe there is a false equivalence? And Fiona, I'm going to go to you. What do you think? Yeah.
Well, I think pretty much yes. It is entirely a false. It's entirely a false equivalence. I think the U.S. have been very smart in the sense that, you know, they've had centuries. I always say they've had centuries to curate their propaganda machine, their imperialist propaganda machine, so that everything that comes out of their mouth, it sounds true, it sounds great, it sounds, you know, it sounds solid, even if there's nothing to back it up. So, for instance, with the war on terror, I mean, the U.S. themselves have, you know, have made comparisons and said, oh, you know, we've also tried to bring democracy and freedom to the quote unquote Middle East, but not like how China's doing. We haven't genocided people, whatever. Like, they have their whole list of other claims. So I feel like when people try to compare what is happening in China as a sovereign state, which has not colonized other parts of the world. In fact, China has been colonized by, what was it, Portugal, Japan, US, Britain, like over its however many the past few centuries. It underwent a century of humiliation in which it was, you know, its GDP was one of the lowest in the world, and you know, it had the life expectancy before 1949 was 35. But now we have a nation that is thriving with a you know, with a sizable Muslim population, but again, it's not, it's a secular state. There are people of multiple religions, community groups, which are supported by the state, so long as obviously they abide by, you know, the laws. They don't try to mix church and state as well. So obviously, with outside influences, China has faced a very big problem, as I think Kiran, you were saying about, you know, about ETIM and the influence they're having on Xinjiang, because Xinjiang sits on the borders with the rest of West Asia. This means that they have been, unfortunately, susceptible to a lot of outside influence, which has meant that a lot of vulnerable people, a lot of impoverished people have been, you know, have been swayed by ideologies, far-right ideologies that say that, you know, we can, the Chinese state, what they're doing, they're you know, they're oppressing you, they're taking away your freedoms, we can give it to you. Come and fight for us, come and stand by us, and we will give you everything that you're not getting by the Chinese state. And I think that's something that that China has noticed is a gap in their policies, is that they have not focused so much in Xinjiang on ethnic minority populations, to the point where, you know, the situation has gotten out of control. There have been hundreds of terror attacks. Not all of them have been made public, because China does not go for the sensationalist front for the most part. Like, a lot of these terror attacks, they are dealt with very locally on a local governmental level. And again, with the whole thing about, you know, the Uyghur Autonomous Region, it is a region which is governed predominantly by the Uyghur population, who have a very strong legislative control over the area. So these policies themselves were in fact created by Uyghur Muslims. And, you know, obviously identity politics, representation politics.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. However, in the context of Xinjiang, where it is, you know, it is Xinjiang people governing their own region with, you obviously, direction by the state, it's important to recognize that they know the needs of their people. They know that for however many of the past few decades, since the creation of ETIP and you know, the influence of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they know that the material needs of the people need to be met. They know that they need to protect and secure the people in order to ensure the majority Muslim population is safe. Because at the end of the day, the victims of the majority of these terror attacks have been Uyghur Muslims. Yes, Han people obviously have been caught in ethnic conflicts and ethnic tensions, as well as other minority groups. But at the end of the day, it is Uyghur women in particular, who I was reading, who have been targeted because they have not followed this so-called version of Islam that has been essentially sort of like pushed into the area. Because historically, again, I'm just throwing back to the earlier reference to alcohol, and how there was a video of Uyghur women drinking alcohol, you know, like vineyards and wine. I don't know what the word, wine brewing, I don't know what the word is for, but cultivating, you know, vineyards and making wine has been an intrinsic part of Uyghur culture going back centuries and centuries. So there's a lot there to unpack, to contextualize, that doesn't apply to other Muslim countries, to other Muslim regions, to other Muslim sects, for example. And I feel like the West just doesn't understand, or they don't want to understand the fact that the situation in Xinjiang, yes, it's not ideal to have a quote-unquote surveillance state. It's not ideal to have metal detectors everywhere and, you know, to be constantly stopped and ID checked. But for the grand safety of the people, of the ethnic minorities in the region, to be protected from these outside forces trying to, you know, force them into a way of life that they have not experienced, that is, you know, the key need.
And the double standard again, you know, like let's you know, think about the surveillance state in the United States, for instance. Like, it's, you know, why anyway, I could go on. I can go on a rant, but I know Kiran wants to touch base on this as well. I'm pretty sure she does, right? Do you want to touch base on that question? Okay.
Basically, I looked up some numbers, and in the last 2 decades, and it might be Western powers have actually murdered millions of Muslims.
Yeah.
Like, actually documented millions of Muslims have been murdered, both through bombs as well as sanctions. And that's just Muslims. We're not even counting everybody else, like Venezuelans and everything like that. But just the Muslims. The NATO alliance has reduced Muslim cities to rubble. They have destroyed entire cities where Muslims live. They have killed children. What is happening in Yemen? Are those not Muslims? What is the U.S. doing? The U.S. and its allies have destroyed. What is happening in Guantanamo Bay? What were those pictures that came out of Abu Ghraib? And you're telling us that these people care about Muslims? China has dealt with terrorism and extremism by educating people. China has dealt with them by building highways and giving them jobs and bringing them business opportunities so that they can actually have a life to look forward to.
Exactly.
United States, the war on terror that the United States has waged, and the United States and its allies, including Canada, have taken part in, has destroyed Muslims. This war on terror has not made the lives of any Muslim better, other than maybe, the people who are willing to sell out to them for a few dollars for a green card. But, the United States also uses these narratives, these personal narratives, as what we were talking about, like the Nayara testimony that was used. This young woman came on TV and said that Kuwait was that Iraq was smashing the babies out of incubators in Kuwait, and based on this, America again went into Iraq, and this was back in the 90s, and then it turned out that this young woman was the daughter of the U.S. ambassador, and there was never any retribution or any kind of accountability on any of this. So what I'm saying is that these personal testimonies, as Omar was saying also earlier, we have to be careful about these. They are supposed to pull on our heartstrings. They're supposed to make us emotionally react like, oh my God, we must do something. And that's what they're relying on. They're relying on us to beg them to go to war. That's what they want.
Yep. Manufacturing the consent. So there is some other questions that, because I know it's getting late for Fiona, or later. But I want to just, there's a couple other questions that we can probably touch base on. And one of them I think I think we should save it till the end. But where is it? It's why do people say that China is an ethno-state? That was a question from, who was that from again?
From Sage.
Anyway, Sage. Okay. So Omar, Fiona, do you want to answer that?
Why do people say that China is an ethno-state, has the same ethnicity and racial profiling? So again, this kind of projection, like, go ahead, Omar.
China's population is 1.4 billion people. 92% of them are Han Chinese. 8% of them are divided amongst various, as you pointed out, 57 nationalities, 55. Big or small, right? So it is, in one sense, a very homogeneous population, 92% Han Chinese, and 8% of other ethnicities. As far as China has tried, that other national minorities either have autonomous republics, as Fiona pointed out, or have self-governing aspects to their communities as much as possible. It is also true that if you draw a line northeast from China, from the northeastern border to the southwestern, it's called, I believe, I forget the name now, but it doesn't exist. But if you draw an imaginary line, 94%, 95% of the population is east of that line, and 5 or 6% or 7% is west of that line. You can just draw out a map of China. The main Han population is east of that line. It's along the eastern seacoast. It's along the flatlands where the 3 great rivers flow, and the western Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, Tibet, etc. Those are those are mainly ethnic nationalities. So yes, it is a multinational country, but with the smaller nations being a very small part of the overall population.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Fiona, go for it. Jump in.
I just wanted to add as well, in terms of why do people say it's an ethno-state, I think there's this, again, it's a case of projection. It's a projection of how white supremacy has worked over the past however many centuries. Like, it's a tale as old as time. The white people will go and colonize like a foreign land and call it theirs and occupy and settle. However, people like to, again, put this onto China and say that because the Han people are the majority, that they are settlers in China. And you'll see these horrible maps where some people have attempted to balkanize China into, like, I don't know, hundreds of different regions and corners, which just don't make sense, or at best or at worst, they mimic what Japan wanted to do to China. And of course, Japan was the imperializing force, and has also been involved in the massacre of millions of Chinese people, Chinese women in particular. But that aside, we just have to remember that Han in itself is not a monolith. Han is not white people. Han is not synonymous to white people. Han is a very, very diverse, it's just, you know, an umbrella term for a very, very diverse set of people, of various cultures, or various dialects, or various languages. Like you would have heard of, you know, Cantonese, Hokkien, Teochew. Those are just a few languages that are spoken, but there are lineages and lineages of different ethnic groups even within that. Even within my own family, there's, you know, some of them are Han, some of them are ethnic minorities, but even with Han, there's, you know, ethnic minorities, if you want to call it that, within Han. And you'll find that across China, there are certain regions which won't actually understand each other. So for example, you know, Shanghainese people, that is a dialect, sure, but it's almost a language unto itself. It's different from the centrally spoken Mandarin spoken in Beijing, for example. And this is endemic across China. Like, just because all these people are Han, it does not mean that, you know, everyone speaks the same language. Everyone is part of the same culture. Everyone is part of this majority. Whereas, you know, in the South, the cultures in the South are very different to North, and vice versa. As everyone has been expressing, it is a country of 1.4 billion. And it's a country of 1.4 billion because it has been allowed to prosper. The population has been allowed to rise. And for better or for worse, under Deng Xiaoping's policy of, you know, the one-child policy, a lot of that was to, in one essence, suppress, and I use that word very liberally, so don't read too much into that, to suppress the Han population, in the sense to allow other ethnic groups, other ethnic minorities who have not been allowed to flourish because of their material conditions, because of the impoverished nature of their communities under feudalism, under slavery, or serfdom in some cases, to allow their population to rise, to be able to, you know, to be able to contribute to China, to be able to be a part of China without that suppression. And they are actually, ethnic minority groups are actually overrepresented in the National People's Congress, which, you know, the same cannot be said for many nations in this world, of many settler colonial regions of this world. And just a quick point about Xinjiang
I
in
love
itself.
how we're Sorry.
Yeah.
I love how we're pointing out these double standards constantly. I'm loving this about
Yeah.
the conversation. Go on. Fiona, say another point.
Yeah, just a quick one about Xinjiang, actually, is that there's this myth that, you know, Uyghur people are indigenous to the area, that Han settlers came and occupied and invaded. And again, this is a very Eurocentric narrative, which is based entirely on projection. Indigeneity is not as simple as, you know, ethnic group were here first, therefore they claim that. It's a lot more complicated than that, and especially in somewhere like China, where, you know, it's had a very, very complex history, a very feudal history, and in which, you know, technically, if we wanted to go into the ins and outs of it, historically, Han people were the first people to sort of like settle in Xinjiang. They have been there for thousands of years. The Uyghur population obviously did migrate at some point, as did the Kazakhs, as did many other ethnic groups. But it's not a case of colonization, occupation. It is simply a case of history of the mass mobilization of people as the country developed, as different dynasties and empires developed and branched out. And with different autonomous regions such as Tibet and Xinjiang, if you look into the history, you will find that there have been multiple pacts made with, you know, the central China and dynasties and, you know, all of them, and the autonomous regions, which obviously weren't called that back then, wherein in exchange for, you know, protection, in exchange for, you know, soldiers and armies to protect these lands from outside invaders outside of China, that these regions would be a part of China and be integrated with it, which would then allow trade. So historically, it isn't a settler colonial state, not by any means. It has been a history, a very complicated, bloody history. No one is going to deny that. But a lot of the relations have been based on, you know, mutual respect and of, you know, of different needs, trades being met. So again, I would just stress to anybody watching is to look into the actual history of Xinjiang, of the different movements across China, because Chinese history is, you can't learn Chinese history in a few hours. it will take years and years to fully understand it. So I'd highly encourage the people to divest from this white supremacist Eurocentric notion of one group of people colonizing another in the global South.
And there's also a lot of chauvinism, Western chauvinism around that too. And I wanted to use that word specifically. But yeah, I'm so glad you brought up those points. Omar, you were going to say something?
Yes, I mean, like, it's white Western countries which are laying these charges against China, one. Number two is that the populations, in my article, I point out that 46% of the population of Xinjiang is Uyghur, 41% is Han, 6.5% is Kazakh, and 4.5% is Hui, and then there's a couple of percent of other people. Friends who are watching this, Google this. There is an organization called the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organizations, UNPO, Unrecognized Nations and Peoples Organizations. It is very close to the Dalai Lama exile group. Google this. They'll tell you that the population of the Tibetan Autonomous Region is about 3 million people. 93% of those people are Tibetans. 7% are Han Chinese. I'm not saying it. Somebody else isn't saying it. This is the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organizations, an organization which is close to the Dalai Lama. So I don't know if there's other questions or
no? Well, actually, we have another guest with us now. Thank you so much for joining us, Andre, even though we are only going to be here for another maybe 15, 20 minutes. But thank you so much for joining us. I want to say hello to Andre. Say hello, Andre.
No problem. Hi, how you doing?
Good,
Sorry I
thank
came in
you.
so late. No worries.
Better late than never. Come on.
I was out of town most of the day today. Get out of here. I was out of town, and I booked it all the way back just to be here with you all.
Aw. Well,
Yeah.
we're honored to have you back again. I mean, I don't know if you caught any of the live stream that we were having, Andre, but Omar and Fiona have been and Kiran really breaking down and debunking some sort of myths and the just insane amount of misinformation and just information in general that people in the West are being bombarded with. So trying to piece out, wade through it. What's the truth? What isn't? How can we look at this critically? And another aspect that I think, Kiran, you really want to talk about is the backlash. Social media back. Yeah.
And I was hoping that Andre could chime in on that, because I know, Andre, you have dealt with it a lot. Now, Andre, in the last hour and 45 minutes, what we did was we debunked, as Moxie said, we debunked a lot of the information that's being put out there. Omar shared his personal experience as well of going to Xinjiang and some photos that he had taken. Fiona shared a lot of information about the way that women are being gaining more autonomy and stuff like that, and all kinds of stuff. So but whenever the topic comes up, and none of us here is completely blind to any issues within China, whether it be ongoing patriarchal issues, ongoing surveillance state issues, and all of that. We are not uncritical. The issue is that when you talk about China in any positive way, in any when you try to point out the good things that China's doing, or when you do any kind of comparison with the colonialism, the ongoing colonialism that Canada and the US are doing to the world and to their own populations, you get this backlash. And I know you recently have dealt with a lot of that. And, do you want to kind of talk about that a little bit? Like what that was like for you?
Well, I mean, what I've been dealing with is, taking a critical look at the sources that are put in front of me, right? So when for example, I'm told that there are mosques being bulldozed by the CCP in Xinjiang, I asked the question, okay, well, what proof do we have that mosques are being bulldozed? And then I get linked to some like geocaching adventures, where if a building is shown in a snapshot from satellite imagery on one date, and then on another date when there's a snapshot of the same area, then the building is non-existent, or maybe the building still exists, or a new building exists, but there's no longer a dome on it. Then I'm to understand that a mosque has been bulldozed, and I say, according to what? Like, what proof do I have of that? And when I look at the source of this claim that these mosques are being bulldozed, it originates from the World Uyghur Congress. And of course, this is an organization that's funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is basically, it does the work of the CIA without the CIA standing behind it. And it's received about $350,000, I believe, in 2019. So I guess my question is, if there's an organization that's being literally funded by the U.S. State Department, how credible are they really? It used to be that, back in the late 1960s and the 1970s, when you find out that a foreign organization or an organization that was supposedly representing people from outside of the United States was funded by the CIA, immediately some red flags go up. But when an organization is funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, nobody asks any questions, even though it essentially fulfills the exact same purpose that the CIA was supposed to do. So I was a little bit blown away by people's reactions to me saying like, well, this organization to me is not credible in my mind because it's being funded by the U.S. State Department. And you look at, you look even further into why is it that all these Uyghur and Kazakh groups are being funded by the National Endowment for Democracy? What is it their commonality? And then you learn about, for example, like the government of Turkestan in exile, and you find out that this government in exile, supposedly, or whatever they want to be called, was founded in Washington D.C. You look at the leadership, and it's a bunch of strange people. So I guess like when I start pointing these things out, like look at the leadership of this organization. Like these are not people that are all there in the head, and you look at these organizations that are making these fantabulous claims about mosques being bulldozed and so forth. And what really upsets me is that it seems to me at least that there is the concern for mass surveillance, for preemptive detention, and for racial profiling. Like those to me are human rights concerns that should definitely be raised and definitely are worthy of critique. My problem though is that around those issues, it seems like there's a kernel of a true issue, and then there's just like this gigantic like amorphous glob of sensationalism and fantabulism that arises out of these claims, and it makes it so much more difficult to actually like investigate and to criticize the legitimate human rights abuses. Because if now we're dealing with the accusation of genocide, but the accusation of genocide is founded almost entirely around some strange and inflated numbers, and when I say strange, I mean the origin of those numbers comes from very dubious estimates from dubious organizations that are also State Department cutouts. And then I asked, like, how are we supposed to know exactly what's going on? Why this is what requires a third party investigation, because it seems to me that the people who've been doing the investigating so far and who've been making the accusations so far are not legitimate actors. So that's and again, when you point this out, you get attacked for it and being called, genocide denier and all kinds of names under the sun. But I think what it really stands behind that is people's embarrassment at essentially having been made out to be marks, and that nobody likes being taken for a fool. So it's rather, what would you rather, keep up the act and call out the people who've just pointed out to you that you've been taken for a mark, or do a little bit of like self-reflection and self-investigation as to why it is that you were so readily, how you were so quick and you were so ready to believe those claims from bad actors. And it's obviously easier to get mad at people who point this out.
Totally. And I'm just going to I see Omar wanting to comment there. Omar, jump in. Go ahead.
Very quickly. The Chinese government has asked EU ambassadors or a delegation from the EU to come and visit Xinjiang. They did it in March of 2019, and they have refused, and they repeated the offer several times, and the EU said, no, not right now, some other time. China has also asked the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, who my understanding is wants to go, but the United States won't let her do that. In December of 2019, a delegation from the 57-member Organization of Islamic Countries did actually visit Xinjiang. And in March 1st and 2nd, 2019, they'd gone in December 2018. In March 1 and 2, 2019, when the foreign ministers of the organization met in Abu Dhabi or in Dubai, they categorically said that no, there has been no genocide, there is no mistreatment, maltreatment of Muslims in Xinjiang, and as a matter of fact, they are quite satisfied with the condition of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Erdogan of Turkey, he's a great godfather of, he belongs to an Islamist party, and he was making a lot of noise over the years about China's mistreatment of Uyghurs. In 2019, in the summer, he visited China, and Turkish newspaper folks went to Xinjiang, and now Erdogan has changed his mind completely on that, and he has asked Uyghur fighters, Uyghur extremists, to not launch any attacks not to plan any attacks against China, and he has asked them to start moving out of Turkey.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the thing is that the backlash that you get on social media, it gets really bad. And, if you question any kind of mainstream narrative on anything. We saw this happening with Syria, Venezuela, any place that the United States in particular has targeted as an enemy state. All of a sudden you see these throws, like hordes of random accounts show up, or sleeper accounts who are just talking about sports until just today, and all of a sudden they are experts on Venezuela. It just happens. I'm sure it's random and coincidental. So that's the kind of stuff you see, and I know that we've all dealt with it. I mean, I know, Andre, you've dealt with it. Fiona, you've dealt with it. I've dealt with it. I remember
dealing with it. I was going to say, I remember dealing with it when, when there were supposedly millions of people in Sucre, Bolivia, that were upset at the fires happening in the Amazon rainforest, and something needed to be done to bring this nefarious dictator Evo Morales out of power, so that the Amazon rainforest could be saved. And then you look into this organization that is like making all of this noise, Rios de Pie. And it turns out that it's essentially an op that's funded by Thor Halvorsen, and the person who runs the organization is the great granddaughter of Hilarion Daza, a dictator in Bolivia, who's trying to drum up support for a coup, and that's exactly what happened. And when you pointed this out to people, that this organization, the Human Rights Foundation, is an op, like this is basically like an NGO op, and this young lady that's been recruited by them to essentially call for all of the bleeding-hearted liberals to support ousting Evo Morales from power. Also an op. You point this out, and then people get pissed off at you. And it's like, and it's funny how all of the people who said that we need to listen to Bolivians and that this is a nuanced issue and so on and so on, when MES, Movimiento Socialismo, when they end up winning the election and removing the coup regime from power, It's like there's this unanimous like congratulations, and this is what should have happened in the first place, and not a single person who is asking us to quote unquote listen to Bolivians and talking about nuance. Quiet as church mice, nowhere to be found. So it seems like every single time this happens, it's also happened with the EU no longer recognizing Juan Guaido as the interim president, or whatever the hell that's supposed to mean, of Venezuela. Again, quiet as church mice. Nobody's saying anything about that whatsoever. We still recognize him in Canada, I suppose, in the United States, but the EU no longer recognizes him as the interim president. Nobody says anything about that. And everybody who's been saying that, Nicolas Maduro is a dictator and he's not the legitimate president of Venezuela and so on, where are they be found? Nowhere. No one's saying anything about that. So it's like, how many times are we going to play the same story over and over and over until people realize that these narratives coming out of the State Department are absolute bunk?
Yeah. And this is why I like Fiona's work that they're doing, with all of those documents. And I know, Andre, I think you've also looked at some of that work that Fiona had on Twitter, and we've put the link in the chat too. So if you'd like to follow Fiona on Twitter to find those documents, please do. But Fiona, you've really worked to debunk a lot of this stuff, and all of the information and the resources that you put up in these links are based on a lot of it, what we talked about today, the kind of hypocrisy and the contradictions that Andre's pointing out. And, would you, there's another question too, that I think would be important to bring into this piece of the talk today. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, Fiona. Do you think that, Jane asked, do guests think that the part of the reason, aside from anti-communism, of course, that people are willing to believe these Cold War myths, oh, there it is, thanks, Kiran, about China, is just simply anti-Chinese racism? What are your thoughts?
Ooh, that is that's really,
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's yellow parallelism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it's Sino-Missia. It absolutely is. And I'm sorry, I'll let you go ahead. I'll let you go ahead, Fiona.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. No qualms there. I mean, the West historically, there has been, sorry, I know it's not funny, but it's just, it's just ridiculous, really. We're at this point where yellow peril has been, a propagator of so much hatred towards China, towards Chinese people, to anybody racialized or perceived as Chinese. So, I mean, we've seen this recently in particularly in the US and also in the UK. The UK hate crimes against China, well, Southeast Asian people who have been perceived as Chinese has gone up by 300% in the UK. It's 1,200% in the US. So these are, astronomical figures. And there's been a lot of, liberal rad lib thought that, this is anti-Asian racism. This is due to XYZ reason. However, I think what people are really missing is that the root of a lot of these issues is, it is xenophobia. It is the fear of the East. It is the fear of China. It is this manufactured consent for, as everyone has been saying, for war on China, whether that's a Cold War or a hot war, like God forbid. But what's also important to note is that in, I think, the US, I'm not sure how verified and whether this is passed through, the Senate or anything, but as far as I'm aware, there has been $27.4 billion put forward to create an island chain of nuclear missile bases, basically around China. So I don't have the tweet or the article to hand, but essentially it's just, dozens and dozens of bases across, going through the South China Sea, ranging all the way up from Korea and Japan, all the way down to, Philippines, Malaysia. And it just goes to show that a lot of this hatred, it is obviously anti-communism, but that can't be what's the word, extricated from the anti-Chinese sentiment, which, as we already know from the beginning, has emerged as, the Chinese are dirty, they're invaders, they're savages, they're coming to steal our women, to steal our jobs, they're going to turn us all into drug addicts. They're, all sorts of rumors that have built up through the years. You can see horrible magazine covers of, of these caricatures of Chinese men, of Chinese people, of, the whole Fu Manchu type cartoon, which demonizes Chinese people. people. And that has continued on today. The Economist has, been releasing some weird, strange cartoons of, I think it was like Xi Jinping as like a dragon or something like that. Just very, very racist, racialized images. And I think if we don't see that, anti-communism and anti-Chinese sentiment as intrinsically linked, then we're missing a very important link. Because again, the whole argument that, we're not against the Chinese people, we're against the Chinese government. Well, to be honest, that they're one and the same. You can't disentangle them.
That's an excellent point.
The Chinese government have I think it's about over a 90% approval rating based on surveys of millions of people. And these are done by independent sources. In comparison to other countries, that nowhere near as high. And if we think that China has literally the biggest communist party membership in the world, I think it's just over 95 million at the moment. That's 95 million communists who adhere to the Communist Party of China. That's bigger than the entire population of the UK. We can't just dismiss all those millions of voices. There's 1.4 billion voices, almost 99% of them, just to say, oh yeah, no, the people don't believe this. This is just the government brainwashing them. Because that again is another layer of Orientalism. It's another layer of racism, which says that Chinese people they're just brainwashed. They just listen to authority. They're obedient. They're submissive, and it all plays into this narrative again of this evil Chinese dictator who tells people what to do and they all just follow. Like in what world, in what culture has that been the case? In what world do people not protest when there is oppression, when there is injustice? Like even in China, there are protests. You'll see the comments forums and things like they are very busy with people criticizing local governments, local councils on an hourly basis. There are open forums where people just basically shout at officials and they're like, you know what? Why is the prices of buses too high? Why is this not being cleaned up? Why are there potholes? And so it's an entire myth that the Chinese people have nothing to say about what's going on in the government. So for people to say that, oh, the Chinese people are brainwashed into thinking nothing is happening in Xinjiang, that's a complete farce. If there was something happening in Xinjiang, you would, like, hand on heart, just bet that the Chinese people would have something to say about it across social media, across their own state-run networks, whatever. Like, as much as we call CGTN, Xinhua, People's Daily, Global Times, like state-funded, the BBC is also state-funded. The CNN is also state-funded. They're just called publicly owned or publicly funded.
That's yes. Kiran and I talked about that in our media propaganda machine a few episodes back. But this is the thing. It's like I think there is this sort of racist idea that the Chinese people are really subservient, and they the Chinese people had a massive revolution under Mao Zedong and totally transformed their country. That is not a subservient people. That is a radically progressive group of people that absolutely, I agree with you, Fiona, would 100% condemn a genocide happening in their country, in their borders. So I think that's an excellent point that you made. But I'd like to throw the floor to Kiran, Omar, and Andre to comment on some of the stuff that Fiona mentioned, as well as that question that Jane had put out around the racism towards Chinese people.
I know, Andre, you had something to add to that.
Oh yeah, just I only found out it was like last week or so that the term brainwashing, when it was introduced to the West. Now I didn't know this. There was a book released by a journalist, an alleged CIA agent named Edward Hunter, and this book was written to try to understand why it is that American troops, and there was like just over a dozen of them, would defect to North Korea after the war. And the book was called Brainwashing, or Brainwashing in Red China. And the idea was that there was some process that Chinese people were being put through to completely control their minds. And like the subtitle of it was The Calculated Destruction of Men's Minds. And the blurb was the first revelation of the terrifying methods that have put an entire nation under hypnotic control, explaining the mystery behind the voluntary, quote unquote, confessions of the innocent. It's like this is nothing but yellow parallelism, and the advertisements for this book were absolutely like comically xenophobic. But the interesting part about that was that the CIA would then request permission to sort of reverse engineer the process that was causing people to be quote unquote brainwashed. And that led to Project Bluebird, which led to MK Ultra. So this idea that you could cause people through the forced administration of like hallucinogens and other psychoactive drugs, you're going to get them to do things that they may otherwise not have done, all the way including like sabotage and even murder. So this project to completely like experiment on people's minds with hallucinogens and drugs, etc., is based on this idea that China is already doing it. So basically, America had to close the mind control gap. And we have an interest in knowing about this in Canada because there was an experimentation being carried out in Montreal. And this project, like obviously it was shuttered in the 1970s, but this idea that because China has got this somehow this control over their docile people's minds, requires Americans to be able to like entice or coerce or by brute force on somebody's mind, cause them to kill. And it speaks to this idea of projection, that things that America is already doing or intends on doing, it has to project on some foreign force in order to justify what it was going to do in the first place.
Yes.
Exactly.
Omar, go ahead.
Exactly.
We've seen that enemies of the state, they've always been maligned, whether it was the indigenous people, whether it was Black people, Arabs, Muslims, whatever. They've always been demonized, and now they're demonizing China. Know that the Western media lies, and in this case, in the majority of instances, they're lying. Don't take my word for it. Please go and see China for yourself. It is not even a question of defending China's system of governance or whatever, but having this enemy, having this enemy, what is it doing? It is helping the military-industrial complex from ever greater defense budgets. Canada's defense budget now is $32 billion a year. And Canada is going to be spending $200 billion over the next 20 or 30 years over submarines and fighter planes and tanks or whatever. We need these billions of dollars to go for social services. The United States, its defense budget is $740 billion. It is greater than the next defense budgets of the next 15 countries put together. Imagine of $740 billion. If only half of it were to be spent on buildings, housing, not-for-profit housing, for giving Medicare to its people, for building, for providing adequate food, for senior citizens, etc., how much better off would the people of the United States be? Canada should do the same. Its arrest of Ms. Meng was completely an unjustified act. They should release her. They should have a friendly and a mutually beneficial relationship with China. It'll be better for the people of China. It'll be better for the people of Canada.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, and just to make a comment to Kiran, you mentioned earlier about the rates of poverty growth in Canada, extreme poverty. Meanwhile, millions and millions of people have been lifted out of poverty in China, extreme poverty in China, and in Canada, those rates are growing. We're at like close to 5 million people living in extreme poverty, and in a fairly small population that Canada has, like compared to China and the United States, for instance. But Kiran, can you talk to some of that stuff too that Omar, Andre, and Fiona were chatting about?
Definitely. First of all, we saw with the so-called war on terror, when the U.S. needed an excuse to go and bomb Muslims, then all of a sudden we saw a rise in Islamophobia. And now what we're seeing is the U.S. propping up war propaganda against China. So now we're seeing a rise in anti-Asian and East Asian and Asian racism. So this. What I want to point out is that a lot of times liberals in the West, they speak about anti-Asian racism or Islamophobia, but they don't make the connection to imperialism. They don't make the connection to what is actually going on, why these narratives exist in the first place, which is to justify imperialism. The reason that these anti-Asian racist attacks are happening is because the US media and Canadian media is full of anti-Chinese racism and imperialism. That's why these attacks are happening. Just the same reason why that was happening against Muslims for the last 20, 25, or more years. The other thing I wanted to point out was that the military budgets, what Omar mentioned, I wanted to point out also with the US, recently China's defense budget is actually going to be increased by 6.8%, which is going in line with their economy. So their economy is increasing and their military budget is going to basically keep up with it. However, their military budget is only going to be $209 billion, which is a lot. But the U.S. military budget is $740 billion. So the U.S. has the biggest military budget. That does not include discretionary bills or the nuclear weapons budget. So it's actually well over $1 trillion. That's what I've seen. And China's military budget is $209 billion. And like we've mentioned before, the U.S. has somewhere between 800 to 1,000 foreign military bases all over the world, in almost every country in the world, or at least most countries in the world. And China has one military base in Djibouti, Africa. And, we have to kind of keep these things in mind when we're talking to people.
Perspective.
We have to keep this, we are being fed war propaganda. And if we want, and these are nuclear powers, and the US is the only country that has a first use policy. China and other nuclear states actually have a no first use policy, which means they have committed to never using nuclear weapons for the first as a initial they have committed to never use nuclear weapons aggressively. The US has never committed to that, which means the US has left itself open to using nukes whenever it wants. And US is the only country that has used nukes on civilians twice, in the past. And we have to kind of remember these things when we're talking to people, and we have to remember who we're talking about. We are talking about war. We're talking about major war that we are being fed. This is not a joke. This is not a game. This kind of propaganda leads to war. It has done it in the past, and they're trying to do it again, and we cannot let it win. Yeah. And on that note, I want to turn to our guests and ask you guys what you all think we should be doing in terms of how we should be talking to our friends and family about this topic, or what we should be doing. What are some of your ideas for that?
I mean, when I talk to my friends and family about this stuff, I don't really have to say much because I have family that work in East Asia. Like, I've got family that work in Indonesia, that work in China, etc. So there's not really a heck of a lot that has to be said. Like, they're not really buying into any of the propaganda. But for people who do have to deal with this stuff, and who have family members that might be ignorant about it and so forth, and talk about trying to take over, etc., etc., you're never going to win them over with facts. Unfortunately, it's just not going to happen. Yeah. You're going to try to win them over with, yes, but what about this? And, what about this event it's never going to work. And so that's never been my approach. My approach has always been, consider the source. Look at the source of your information and tell me how that makes any sense, right? The source of your information is XYZ organization funded by XYZ organization that is directly tied to the State Department. And if the United States is funding, NGOs, then do those NGOs not have, some possible conflict of interest when everything they say is in the greater interest of the State Department? So, especially if you have people that are like like Fox News watchers or cable news watchers and so forth. It's just you have to ask the question, like, okay, so why is it that you disbelieve everything that you hear in this case, but you believe everything you hear in that case? Try to make that make sense. But aside from that, I mean, I don't really know how to change people's minds on this stuff. It tends to be made up, but don't let yourself get BS is all I'm trying to say.
I agree. And yeah, those are some good advice. I'd also just like to echo a little bit what Kiran said, because I know we're wrapping up right now, but a little echo on Kiran's part is that war is the way that this is going. This Cold War could become, hopefully not, but there is that possibility it could become a hot war, a physical war, and we need to be really careful as anti-imperialist leftists on how we talk and how we criticize China. We don't want to become part of that propaganda machine or add fuel to the fire, right? Or have our words twisted. We have to be very careful. We have to be more vigilant around our facts and our resources. And to Andre's point, follow the power, follow the money. Look at those things. We also want to make sure that we are being principled in our stance, and we are being the people to sort of to be the go-to source for information, to get a balanced perspective, right? And I know, Fiona, your document is something that I think is a great resource. There's lots of things that people can go and click on and be able to get a balanced perspective. Any final thoughts, Fiona, and then Omar? Final thoughts on what Kiran's mentioning about how combat some of these things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, the biggest, the most successful method, as it were, of encouraging people to think differently and have a different perspective on China is often pointing out the hypocrisies of, for example, the BBC, of all these Western media outlets and how they report on issues in the UK, how they are so biased towards the conservatives, the right wing in the UK, and then making a comparison, as in, okay, if this country, if the UK is doing so horribly here, if impoverished people here, if the working class here is being so disseminated in the UK, why is it that the UK is so concerned about what's happening over there? Why is it accusing China of doing X, Y, Z? When in actual fact, there's so many problems here in the UK. And in pointing out these double standards, in also linking it to the history, especially with, I feel like, people of color. If you're like of African, Asian, Latin American descent, I find that also pointing out the colonial history of Britain, in particular, or the US, and how propaganda has been released to colonize our peoples, and why we are then trusting these same mouthpieces on what they're saying about our homelands, about our home countries, has been has been mildly successful. But again, I think, as Andre was saying, facts don't always work. People like the emotions, people like the stories. So what I found is, if you're able to, if there are people in your life who you genuinely think would benefit from having their, I mean, everyone will benefit, but if there are people who genuinely think it would be productive to change their minds on China, for example, I would honestly suggest like clearing a schedule for a few hours, sitting down with them, and honestly, just telling them a bit of a story about what's been going on, throwing in some anecdotes, throwing in some sources, making sure obviously it's all verifiable scientific data. But if you wield it into a story, people have been much more likely to connect. I remember I was sitting at someone's house party at one point, and my friend brought along someone, and they're like, "Look, come sit with Fiona. They'll tell you all about the DPRK." And I literally spent, I think, 3 hours at that house party just breaking down every single little thing. And for better or for worse, they messaged me literally the next day, being like, "Thank you for having that chat with me. Like, my mind has been blown. Like, I've looked at this, and this, and it's amazing. I didn't even realize." And they've gone on to then propagandize to their friends and explain to their friends what's going on. So to be honest, it really is sort of like, it can be a chain reaction of, if there's just that one person who does have an influence, who does have, a voice in, social circles or whatever, convincing them can be very important. And of course, the document always, like, it's always there. I haven't updated it in a couple of months, I'm not even gonna lie. So there's a lot more new resources, great resources that hopefully I'll be able to add there over the next week. And anyone else who wants to collaborate on that, I'm always open to having people help to submit links. But ultimately, again, I think especially with Chinese sources, like Chinese state-funded sources, always go to the BBC is also in essence state-funded. CNN is also in essence state-funded, but you believe them because the things they say, or you assume they're verifiable. You assume that there has been research done in it. So just have that same level of critique, don't have double standards for Chinese state media. Basically, it doesn't mean they're any more biased. In fact, like, again, look at the history of colonization, of how Britain tried to convince the world that, empire was a great thing, and how even within our own communities, there's so much internalized racism. There's still this belief that, there's still colonial nostalgia, especially in, Hong Kong and Singapore, for example, where the youth, for some reason, you see in the Hong Kong protests, they somehow think Britain is the savior. Britain's going to come and save Hong Kong from what I do not know. But so I think it's just very important to point out the hypocrisies, do the storytelling, and always have sources on hand, which is why with the document, something that I'm really going to try and work harder on is breaking it down into, those little subtitles, those subheadings, those little topics, niche topics that will come up again and again and again. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on this panel. It's been lovely.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you so much. Omar?
I agree that one should look at all sources. Western media, I think most of us realize, are going to lie about their enemies, China being the enemy of the day. The thing is that look at the motives of the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, the BBC, why they're saying what they're saying. Look at alternate sources. They're available at the click of a button. Chinese sources in English, Global Times, Xinhua News, Beijing Review, etc., etc. Make up your minds yourselves. There is a Facebook group called the Kiao Collective,
I love them.
QAO. And so they have a lot of information which rebuts what the West is saying. Please look it up, make up your minds, and do try and go to visit Xinjiang yourself. Thanks.
Omar, I'm so glad you mentioned them. Kiran, let's make sure to post their links.
I just did, yeah.
Oh, awesome, because they are excellent resource. So thank you for mentioning that, Omar.
1 second.
Yeah.
People can go to my Facebook page, and I have written a short article titled China, the West, and the Uyghurs. Omar Latif on Facebook. Have a look at that. I've tried to summarize the main points, the main charges that are leveled against China, and try to answer them. I would welcome your criticisms, your comments on it, but it is almost everything that we've spoken about is that in a few hundred words.
Okay, and I'll post that link too that you just mentioned. I'm just going to post it in the live chat now. Okay.
Yeah, and I just want to say thank you to our guests for joining us today. I highly echo what Omar is saying. If you can scrap together a little bit of money, and in fact, there are some the government of China actually subsidizes tours and travel, because they want to encourage tourism. So not right now during the pandemic, but before, and I'm sure after, it's going to continue. Go to China, see it for yourself. Go on your own. You don't have to go along, with anybody else or with any kind of delegation. If you can put together a few bucks, go to China, because what you will see there, you will learn for yourself, because it will stop being, this mystical, mysterious place, which is what the Western narrative and Western chauvinism teaches us. that it's
Yes.
this mysterious place that we can never fully scrutinize. It's not
Mhm.
like that. It's just a place full of human beings doing things, trying to get by, messing up a little bit, doing good things. It's just a place with human beings just like us.
Yeah,
And we
exactly.
need to stop making, we need to make those connections and go to China. I've also put a link to the Chow Collective that Omar was mentioning. Go visit their website. They're all over social media. You probably already know about them. If you don't, check them out. They're a great resource for all kinds of
Yeah.
news and information, and really intelligent information about China.
Really good. Yeah. And I think we're going to wrap up now, but please, people, share this, subscribe our channel. We put Andre's Twitter handle. The link to Omar's article is in the chats, and Fiona, we put their Twitter handle as well in the chat. Please support leftist anti-imperialist voices. Please, let's get this anti-imperialist perspective out there. Let's just really push. Let's be vigilant. Let's be diligent. Thank you so much, everybody. I've really enjoyed this discussion. It's been a marathon, but it's been very informative and really great. So I think that this is a necessary conversation to continue. I would love, I know Kiran, I know you're going to probably say the same thing, so I'm going to beat you to it. We'd love to have you all back on to talk about China in a couple of weeks. We'll set a date. We'll let everybody know, and we'll try and work something out. Let's continue this discussion. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Big love, comrades. It was so nice to have a nice big panel of a whole bunch of Marxist-Leninists talking about anti-imperialism in China. This is fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody. Happy Saturday.
Thank you. And thank you to our audience for watching. Thank you to each of us. Thank you, Andre, Fiona, Omar, for joining us today. And please come back. We will see you again.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.